sure it ever stopped recording. So, we'll see. All right, in this section we're going to look now at social power, power distance in intercultural communication. The reality is in every society there are stratifications of power. That's just simple reality, and it starts from parents and children. Parents have power over children. Children reciprocate at times. Crying and screaming is one way an infant deals with getting the attention that the child needs. And when it's very young, it doesn't even know just what it needs that attention for. But in all societies, people grow up in situations where there are stratifications of social power. The question is, how do they idealize those stratifications? So power distance refers to the degree to which members of a culture idealize distinguishing a social power among the members. The extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a community expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. And the reality is it is. There is a part at which in the U.S., if the president is driving a car privately, if that would ever happen while a person is sitting as president and breaking the speed limit, then we kind of anticipate that they should be subject to the law. In the presidential motorcade, of course, they're not. And when we think about issues of power, one of the things that often happens is in larger power distance settings, people simply accept that. In smaller power distance settings, usually people at the lower end are trying to find ways to increase their power, and people at the higher end might be trying to find ways to keep people from increasing it too much. Now, when we see this, small power distance cultures idealize equalization of power, especially among those close to each other in social power. So I just said that the opposite way around. I was talking about large power distance cultures. But in large power distance cultures, they idealize the maintenance of power and clear distinctions even among those close to each other in social power. So some of our students were attending a Vietnamese church and they didn't understand why the Vietnamese church members wanted to know what month they were born. Well, the reality is in Vietnamese culture, as in many cultures of the world, if I'm born before you, I am forever your older brother or sister. And if we're both 25, then I need to know what month you were born in, so I still need to know whether I'm older than you or younger than you, because that defines our relationship to each other, all other things being equal. Whereas we tend not to think about that in our smaller power distance setting, though you do see this when we have rules of who's been in the company longer. And it's anticipated in some companies, unions in particular, where you get prioritization based on how long you've been in the union or part of the employment setting that you're talking about. But again, the question is, to what extent does the culture idealize it? In Israel, a proverb is that a private can tell a general what to do. That's a very small power distance approach. Malaysia, which has the largest power distance of any of the cultures measured, a private would never even think about telling a corporal what to do, let alone a general. So when we look at power distance characteristics, small power distance societies will value equality. They will tend to value independence. They will value impersonal truth. The issue is, what is the policy more than anything else? Excuse me. And they will value the ability to negotiate with each other. In a case like this, often the boss's job after a decision has been made is to convince employees that it was the right decision, because it's anticipated they have a role and a say in that. And so when we teach organizational culture, often it's built on an idealization of a smaller power distance, because in a larger power distance setting, the boss sets the policy, and that's the end of the story. You don't have to convince people. The convincing is the fact that you are the boss and you made it. But when people in small power distance settings operate from a large power distance base, they're dictators. Discussion then as well too, again among members of the organization. On the other hand, in large power distance authorities settings, respect and authority are very important. And you might say, and I've heard an American say this, I respect your position as a leader, but I don't respect you. And in large power distance settings, you cannot distinguish those two things. It's the same thing. And so you have to be extremely careful, especially if you're like me, an American who might stand up against the dictator when the rest of the people in the setting want a dictator, because that's how they're socialized. And it doesn't mean they're wrong, it means they're different. And how far do we go with this? Remember, Livermore talked about category width and how broad are your categories. I'm not sure those labels are correct. Really what he's talking about is you broaden the middle category, the gray category, whereas when you broaden that category, you make the absolute right and the absolute wrong categories each a little bit smaller. So those get narrower the broader the gray category gets, so it's really broadening one particular category. There is dependence on the leader. This is one of the reasons in African settings where I was, often the middle managers cannot make independent decisions. So if you ask them to do something, even if their job description said they could do it, they're always looking to the boss to make the final call. Now, we saw this in Kenya at the school where I taught, where often a committee would meet, and if it was dealing with an issue of a student grievance or student discipline, we realized as soon as the committee made the decision and communicated it to the student, if the student was dissatisfied, the first thing the student would do was not to go to the committee. The student would go straight to the president of the school and try and get it sorted out there. So one of the things we began to do to short circuit that, if I can put it that way, is we would take our decision first to the president once we had made the decision, inform him, and if he was going to change the decision, he would do it then. And then we would communicate the decision to the student. So that way, if the student came to the president already had the contexting of the decision. It would not simply overturn our decision, as was his right in our particular setting. Instead of an impersonal truth, a policy manual, you have a personal wisdom. I was at a conference of Korean and American, not Korean American, but Korean and American with some Korean Americans, mission leaders, and the conference was on accountability. And one of the statements a Korean made has stuck with me ever since that time. He said, you have to realize you Americans have policy accountability. You look to the policy and you make a decision based on the policy and you apply the policy. He said, we Koreans have relationship accountability. We can look to the policy, but we decide whether or not to follow the policy in light of the relationship that we have with each other, rather than in light of what the policy in and of itself says. So you can see how that's a large power distance approach. It's the personal wisdom of the leader, the relationship you have with the leader, that determines whether the policy should be followed. And Americans are very well known for being policy wonks. And that's what we want. Again, consulting a church in Hong Kong over issues of leadership. I was there to consult their missions committee with some things that were going on. And an American associate pastor asked me, help me understand this, why aren't the deacons rotating off? She didn't understand what was taking place. So I said, well, okay, help me understand a little bit more about the deacons. Who are the deacons? And she described them for me. And the church was a church in Hong Kong, but it was established in the 1850s by a missionary. It still had a large British presence. I said, what is the leadership structure of the church? We have 3 boards. We have a board of management, a board of trustees, and a board of deacons. And I said, okay, well, who's on the board of deacons? That was all Chinese. Who's on the board of trustees? That's all British with a couple of Chinese. Who's on the board of management? That's all Americans. So you talk about fitting certain levels of stereotype that fit it quite well. But I said, how many of your trustees were once deacons? And she said, every one of them. I said, well, if you're looking at the Chinese taking a long-term view and interested in rising into the trusteeship, they need to be deacons all the time. Because when a trustee position opens, if they're not a deacon at that time, it removes them from the possibility of becoming a trustee. And she said another issue we have, and I asked about this, is the Americans want a management policy manual for the church. And the British are saying we don't need one, we have our Articles of Incorporation. Remember, the UK, there is no constitution, as opposed to Germany, which has a constitutional provision for what happens when the constitution breaks down. The UK doesn't want all those rules and regulations. They have a higher toleration of ambiguity. The US has a lower toleration of ambiguity. We want those rules and regulations because then we know what to do. So you can see how American partnerships, when you're going cross-culturally, can be a challenge.